Talking to Ravi Lochan Singh today, who is the founder and MD of Global Reach, which is education consultancy with a footprint across India and South Asia. And Ravi is very influential in the Australian education circles. He has deep connections, not just in industry, but across educational institutions in Australia as well. And so we will be asking him about the situation. Of Indian students going to study in Australia, which has always been a popular destination. So, Ravi, we do know that there are headwinds when it comes to certain very popular destinations for Indian students planning to go overseas. If you can tell us, has Australia emerged a stronger this year and over the last couple of years? Do you see more and more Indian students choosing to go to Australia over many other destinations?
Ishani, firstly, thanks for having me on your show. And it's always a delight to be able to contribute to anything that you're putting together. And you've done a commendable amount of work over the years in reporting on what's happening around the world with student destinations. You are
Thank you.
absolutely correct. There are headwinds, and there are also situations. It's not just pertaining to Australia, but what's happening in other parts of the world, which actually influences demand for a particular student destinations. Over the last 3 decades, I've noticed that sometimes students in India have a particular preference for a one destination, and then that changes quite quickly due to certain external developments. In the last, I mean, a lot of your viewers may be too young to know, but things happened in 9/11 around the turn of the millennium, around 2001, and suddenly we saw some other destination emerge. And about 15 years ago, there were certain adverse media reports which brought down Australia as a destination. However, in the last few years, we have seen, and possibly COVID is a major turning point. We saw an emergence of students' interest for Canada, which quickly went down, and right now Canada has lost out or is out of flavor. It's not permanent. It could change in few years from now. But at this point of time, what we are noticing is there's a reduction in demand for US. Somehow US total student numbers this year, you may notice by the end of the year, that'll be down by about 35%. And that's not just because of students not being able to get the interview slots, but also a lot of negativity around post-study work or OPT or change in visa regulations, which is giving a kind of question mark, or students don't know what will happen after they study. And we have to keep one thing in mind, that Indian students don't go to study just because they like a particular subject or they want to get to a good university, but is also they have an eye out on what will happen after they've graduated. So post-study work, possible residency, and things like that do make a difference. Next year, UK is likely to make certain changes. There's a white paper recommendation. We don't know what will be implemented, but it is being expected that by almost everybody, that post-study work might reduce from 2 years to 1.5 years. And there could be certain changes around the number of years required to become a resident in United Kingdom. Right now it's 5 years, it could become 10 years. So those things will have a direct impact on UK numbers. But at the same time, there is a rise of a lot of new destinations. You've got students taking in, looking at Dubai, looking at Europe. Students have been also suddenly woken up that New Zealand could be a good destination. But these things are part and parcel of the story. So what happens if the students who were earlier going to Canada were very price sensitive, were looking for post-study work or the possibility of settling down quickly, and sometimes their budgets were not that big. So Dubai emerged as a good alternative, so did certain European countries. But amongst the top 4, 5 major study destinations, other than US, UK, it has always been Australia. And when we talk about Australia, there are a few things which are going for Australia. First and foremost is that Australia has post-study work which is stable. Students have the possibility to work for 3 years minimum. There could be students who could be working for longer number of years depending on what they are studying. But at the same time, there is a free trade pact between India and Australia where this clause was inserted. And I think hats off to the Indian government who had the foresight to do that, that irrespective of what Australia wants to do in future in terms of reducing the forced study work or whatever, the interest of Indian students is protected. And I really think this is something which got missed out when India and UK signed their free trade pact. So when you really look at it, so Indian students actually have a little longer post-study work as compared to other international students in Australia. Then Australia also has skill shortages. So if a student has studied a program of study which is going towards the skill shortage area, they have a very good chance of being able to move on to a work or settlement. Now, what is in demand keeps changing, but at this point of time, we are seeing an interest for IT, engineering, nursing, healthcare, and things like that. So, keeping all that in mind, Australia is in demand. And also, the last thing is when you look at the Forex movement, Indian rupee to an Australian dollar has almost been at the same level for a period of time. It hasn't become that much more expensive as Indian rupee and US dollar has moved. So, so I think that works also in the favor of the Indian budget.
Right. Thank you for that very insightful reply. If I could ask you to, make a prediction, perhaps, or make a informed guess. So last year there were, I think, over 1.5 lakh Indian students who went to Australia and took admission in various courses, which puts them at number two in terms of the country's students from various countries. I think just after the Chinese were the Indian students. So would you think that that number is likely to go up this year?
Ishani, you might recall that we've had this discussion before. The student numbers is actually less. Now, total number of students going to Australia is actually less. What you are referring to as the number of enrollments. And this is where the numbers, the entire thing gets a little confusing. Enrollments is basically a cumulative figure, the total number of Indian students currently studying in Australia. Australian universities don't even have capacity to have 150,000 new Indian students. Even when you look at, and I think this confusion happens because US releases its data, the open door data comes as enrollment figures. So every country starts giving out enrollment figures, but you shouldn't look at enrollment figures. You should look at the total number of student visas issued from a country. So if you look at US, then you should look at the F1 visa for the primary applicant, and similarly for Australia, you should look at the total number of student visas issued to an Indian passport holder. So when you really look at it, the actual number is much less. However, the number is stable. That's the point that I was trying to make. We could see a slight dip this year, maybe about 10% lower than last year or something like that in the total number of students coming to Australia. But that's got no correlation because if you look around the world, there's a bigger dip. And the second thing to keep in mind is that the visa grant rate has increased. Australia, like many other countries, increases student visa fees. So that was a kind of a screening mechanism. But also at the same time, all the numbers that we are looking at for Australia is to the higher education sector um, or the sector which pertains to the universities. And because Australia has not really been granting visas to the non-university sector from India. So so if we make a like with a like comparison, then US or for any country, then the university bound students going to Australia is has been always very good. And between last year and this year, the numbers are roughly stable. It might have about a 10% decline. You asked me to make a prediction. We don't have the actual figures, but I'm expecting a decline of about 10% for the year. Um, and enrollment data, I'm not putting much weight to that, because that's the number of students who are here studying, and there could be students who are enrolling from one program of study to another program of study, and they'll keep counting. But the new students coming to Australia from India, about 10% lower. Now, if you ask me for other countries, Canada is already quite low. I don't think it can go further down. US, I've already mentioned, could be about a 30% to 35% decline. UK, all we don't know, because September is the intake. We are just around the intake time. My feeling is that it will also be the same or about 10% lower. And But the new destinations will show a growth rate because their base is low. So, you'll see more number of students going to Europe, to Ireland, and possibly to New Zealand, and also to Dubai. So these destinations will basically ramp up the numbers which the other major destinations will lose out on.
Right. Thank you so much for explaining that, the figures. So, if I could, ask you a little bit, not generically, but specifically about Australia. So, we know that Australia is very popular among Indian students from different parts of India. If you could, break it down a little and talk about some of the courses, some of the universities which are very popular. I mean, Australia also has an Ivy League kind of,
Yeah,
a group of universities which are very popular and known globally. So, if
yeah,
you could talk a little about that and some of the new courses. I mean, AI, we know, is a big draw for students across the world. So,
yeah.
what is on offer? What are some of the trends you're seeing of the universities and courses that Indian students are picking when they go to Australia?
Right. Australia has about 40 universities. Eight of them are referred to as the group of eight universities. What basically, I mean, it's like the top eight research intensive universities, or the universities which have more publications and which has more research output. Also, where the government funding is more with of certain kind. And these are, if you look at the geography of Australia, it's actually a country with maybe only 28 million people, but it is a very large landmass. It's almost the size of United States of America in terms of size. It's a continent. So with three time zones. So the students who live in Perth, the domestic students, rarely come to Sydney to study. So every region needs to have a good university. So students living in Brisbane would look at a university near Brisbane, and similarly in other parts of the country. Out of these eight universities, almost all of them, out of the 40 universities, almost about seven or eight of them figure in the top 100 in the world. And I'll tell you, this is a very major thing to see, because that means about 20% of all Australian universities are in the top 100 in the world, which, I mean, it's not a small feat for a country of a small population. Then we look at the other next level universities, which are not necessarily inferior in any way. They are just more practical, or more vocational, or sometimes more, they're doing programs in hospitality or design or anything like that. And they would also figure very well in the rankings. So in the top 200 universities in the world, there would be almost one third of Australian universities, or maybe more. So, and almost all universities would figure in the top 500 in the world. So when you look at the quality of education, I think there is no question about it. They are all very fine institutions, and they don't necessarily do all the same subjects everywhere. So then there are subject rankings. And if, let's say, you want to do medicine, then certain universities are better profiled, or if you want to do engineering or IT. So that's the basic structure about Australian universities. Now comes the next question. What are the Indian students looking for? Indian students are looking for two things, and this is very clear. The urban students, and those who have been exposed or who have done more homework are looking for ranking of institutions. That means how strong a brand they are. And the other is also the quality, or what is covered in the program. When both these things come together, the third comes the cost of education. Now, cost of education, as you know, has been going up, and it's not necessarily very low um, anywhere in the world. If you want to use the word expensive, it is expensive, but I tend to use a word like you're investing in yourself. Today, you want to buy a car, it'll cost you 30 lakhs of rupees. You take it out of a showroom and it goes half the price. But you finish your qualification, it adds to yourself, and it's an investment in yourself. So Indian students are looking for ranking, and that comes from those top 8 or 15 university, depending on top 100 or top 200. And then if you're looking for certain skills, let's say you want to do sports science or sports medicine, then one or two universities are better known, and similarly. And then the third thing is the price. Because students who have their eyes set on possibly working in Australia or settling in Australia also are looking at the courses which are in demand, and sometimes they know which city they want to study in. So if they know X city, then they'll focus it on that university in that city. So Ishani, just to make it very simple, so all these factors come into the decision making. Our counselors sit down with the student, with their parents, and try to make the best match of it. Just studying at a university actually is just waste of time. You really need to know why you are studying, what it's going to lead to, and how you will use it in your own life.
Right. Thank you. I think that was very useful information the way you explained it. If you mentioned post-study work visa, which is definitely one of the attractions of studying in Australia. So, of late, have there been any rules which have made it like tougher for Indian students? If you could go into that a little. And also, you mentioned that Australia has a skills list which keeps changing. But overall, in terms of getting jobs, because we do know that's one of the most important reasons why Indian students go to study abroad, so that they can get return on investment and a pathway to employment. So overall, does it look like in Australia at the moment when we are thinking of the job situation after education?
Okay, two things. Have rules changed? Rules haven't changed. Rules, in fact, as I mentioned earlier, Indian students are protected from the free trade pact between India and Australia. And in fact, the rules did change, but Indian students were protected. So they have roughly the same post-study work rights that they had earlier. I'm talking about post-study work rights. I'm not talking about anything else. If you're talking about permanent residency, then of course skill list comes in. The ability to be able to find an employer and things like that do come into picture. Indian students stand ahead than many others. One, they have strong English skills. And if you look at the point system for permanent residency, English skills do give you more points. So compared to other Asian students, Indian students often from urban cities and better education background, they come with good spoken English and written English skills already. So it's not like a second language. For many students, it's actually their first language based on what they have studied and the way they have studied throughout their life. So Indian students stand at an advantage on two fronts. One, English. The other is they're often young. So you get highest points if you are under 30 years of age. 25 to 30 is the age bracket when you get maximum points in a permanent residency system. Again, bulk of the Indian students are roughly in that age group. Third comes the ability to be able to do courses which are in skill list or shortage list. Most of the skills which are in shortage are what Indian students love to do study anyway. That's engineering and IT. You mentioned things like AI, cybersecurity, and various others which are being talked about. Come on, these things will always happen. There will be new areas which will come out and emerge, but they come under the larger umbrella of STEM. And the STEM programs are what Indian students tend to go overseas to study. Sometimes they are studying that even within India. The other area which is beginning to grow is healthcare and things like even teaching. If you ask for humanities students, they're doing teaching or healthcare. Now, students from Kerala, they make great nurses. There, many of them come for that. They're already studying to do that, and so does certain other students from other parts. It's not easy to come to study medicine in Australia. Getting into medicine programs in Australia is very difficult, and more than it being competitive, it's also expensive for international students. So we don't really see too many students coming to study medicine or dentistry because these are already extremely competitive to gain entry. Then we have students who are coming to do research and PhD. And again, there is a larger post-study work grant provision for those who are doing research studies. So when you really think of it, Indian students are a bit ahead with opportunities. Now, in terms of finding jobs, uh, if you are skilled and if you have a skill in tech area or STEM area, you find it relatively easier to find jobs. Now, you have the post-study work period of 3 years to look for a job um, and get a job. And most students would find something or other because they've already been in Australia for a period of time and established it. It's not guaranteed. Everybody has to look for it in any part of the world, but students are able to discover what they can do and which can help them. I think Indian students are extremely clever. They know exactly how to tailor their future, and they are getting to do that. And that's one of the reasons why you see this demand for Australia in India, because uh, it's not 1 or 2 years, it's an established destination for decades now. So there are, they hear from their own friends. And in fact, a lot of our students have very good connections. They use social media, they do use other things. Of course, we do have some students from time to time who struggle or who find it difficult, but you have to also think of the background from where they are coming in. They are still better off than what they were in India. So when you really look at it in that sense, in the number of Indian students making it to skilled immigration is highest. It's more than even China at this point of time. There are more Indian students moving on and becoming skilled immigrants in Australia. And once they are skilled immigrants for a few years, they have an option to take up Australian citizenship. So that's the way it works.
Right. So, if I could add to what you just said, if I could take off from there and ask you a question related to that. So, Indians are in doing jobs and in leadership positions in various industries across Australia, and that network is growing. Is that also helping Indian students in a in a bigger way to get jobs and placements?
Well, Ishani, I don't think that just because Indians are moving up into the hierarchy, they can be partial to Indian students coming in. It's just that they are making the companies more sensitive to multiculturalism. It's not just Indian students, there's students from Sri Lanka, India, Nepal, Bangladesh. They're all clustered as Indian students in the general way of life. They all look the same, they speak same, they have the similar values. And so, in a way, they are much more visible within organizations. So it's not something which is the relationship between Australia and India is just not around Commonwealth and cricket and curry. It's a little bit more, and Indian students are occupying key roles which often are not filled by the local students. So I think there's pluses and minuses of everything, Ishani. Around the world, there is a big talk around mass immigration, and uh, generally there's a feeling that a lot more Indian students have arrived in the recent years. But you've got to think of how COVID played. There were a few years when Indian students couldn't travel, and suddenly we had more, and the countries had large skill gaps, and those skill gaps were filled by Indian students. So then, of course, there will be some who will feel that Indians have taken their jobs away, but it's not exactly like that. These things are becoming um, pretty noticed, and I think Indian students are trying to assimilate as much as possible with the local culture. I think both these things go hand in hand. Other than at the cricket ground where you'll see them
Mm.
only supporting Indian cricket team, but otherwise they are definitely assimilating with the culture.
Right. So you mentioned about, sort of globally, there are headwinds when it comes to immigration. And we've seen that in Australia very recently, there have been anti-immigrant demonstrations. So would you factor that in when Indian students are, or their parents for that matter, are, thinking of Australia as a destination to send their children to?
I think there are two things, Ishani. One, firstly, headwinds all around the world. So it should not be seen that it's only in Australia. Around the world, there is recession, economy struggle, there's tariff, there is a whole lot of those things are happening around the world. And Indians are far more visible everywhere, whether from shops to whatever you name it. In Australia, it's the same thing. I mean, I know you're mentioning a particular rally which happened this Sunday. It was a cause of concern to many of us in the immigrant community. I don't want to use just the word Indian diaspora because it was actually kind of they're speaking up against the mass immigration. Now, mass immigration is around certain data points they had picked up, the organizers, and they're trying to say that far more number of migrants are arriving in the country on an annual basis than what the housing supply can support. I think the basic crux was that. Second thing is that it was not backed by any of the major political parties. It was not by the Labour or by the National or the Liberal opposition. So none of the national parties were supporting it. And just this week, the Australian government announced that they will keep the total number of skilled immigrant visas or total number of immigrant visas at the same level as last year. So they're not reducing that in any ways. In fact, almost all elements of Australian polity has come out against what has happened in terms of certain demonstrations or certain rallying. It was pretty peaceful by and large. On a Sunday afternoon, they came out in a park and said that Australia needs to take note of the number of immigrants coming into the country. Now, it is still something which bothered at least me because I tend to comment on such issues because the data that they had picked up was all incorrect, stating that there were more Indians who have arrived in Australia than other nationalities over the last 5 years or whatever. I think it's not correct because there have been other nationalities who have arrived. And also at the same time, it was picking up even those who are coming as tourists and others in the total numbers. So I think overall, there's been a bit of a disappointment with what happened. The Australian Prime Minister actually came out and said that I'm a son of a migrant myself. His name is Albanese. He comes from his father's Albanian. So he came out and said that, well, I'm a migrant myself. My foreign minister for Australia, her surname is Wong. So she herself is the daughter of a migrant. So when you really think of it, and in fact he mentioned that almost all Australian, other than the first inhabitants or first people who lived there, the indigenous population, almost everyone is a migrant or a son of a migrant. So or a children of the migrant. So when you really think of it, when the politics or the political leadership is so strong and coming out very clearly in support of the immigrant community, I think there's need to um, breathe now and accept that in every country there will be people who feel that others are coming in to take their jobs. I think they are 1 out of 10 people, they are not 9 out of 10. And so, as long as that happens and the country allows people to express their opinion, we have seen protests in support of the Jews. We've seen protests against the Jews. We've seen Palestinian marches. Almost all universities are very much like the Indian JNU because they have camps and societies there who speak up and say anything around the world. So when there's freedom of expression and which is not curtailed, the government allows them to speak. The newspapers report it. I think it's a very, very good country to live in. There is so anybody can express. I can say whatever I feel like, and I would be, prosecuted for that. When I go to watch a cricket match, I hold the Indian flag, even though I'm an Australian citizen. Nobody really comes out and tells me what am I doing. So I think this is a fantastic country to live in, and I think that message will eventually come out from the Indian community back to the student crowd.
Right. I just wanted to ask two more small specific questions. You've covered a lot, and
Yeah.
this would be very useful for many people who are now making plans to study overseas. So you mentioned accommodation. Is that one of the important points that students who are planning to move to Australia should be looking into? And is there, a scarcity of student accommodation?
Yes, there is. There can never be enough, but we also need less expensive accommodation. Indian students tend to share accommodation. They don't always need, like more expensive on-campus accommodation. So we need to have all kinds of accommodation available, which you can, if you want a more expensive on-campus catered accommodation, that's great, but then there should be others where which can suit their pocket, because if you have more types of accommodation, it can help and reduce exploitation of students. They won't have to work extra hours to cover the costs and things like that. So yes, there is a need to have more accommodation. But at the same time, in recent time, because this issue of accommodation for students has been there for last couple of years, a number of universities have made efforts. They have acquired buildings, converted them into accommodation in recent years. There are homestays available. There are companies which have created custom-built student accommodation the students are using. And also at the same time, there are universities like ANU which are guaranteeing students who are joining the university with an accommodation right up front. Uh, so in that sense, there is more stock or more availability over the last couple of years. But of course, there's more to happen. Now, if the whole issue of accommodation or the housing is not about student accommodation, there was a general feeling among the local population that a lot of students take up accommodation and the country has a shortage of new housing. But many things have been happening. Over the period of COVID, a lot of people started working from home. They have lesser free rooms at home. Also, there are people who've been letting out their places and the Airbnb, and all these things. When you put together, the number of available houses for rent has come down. Now, that led to some people feel that cost of living has gone up and all that. See, it's a chain. However, as far as international students are concerned, there's an effort going on in terms of increasing the housing availability. If an international student plans a few months in advance, they would most likely find something. And once they are here, they can always keep moving and finding something even better. There are apps, there are aggregator of housing such as University Living and various others which have come into business, which are helping students find the accommodation of their choice.
Right. So, of recently, maybe a couple of months back, there was some talk about students from some Indian states facing restrictions or, a stricter scrutiny when it comes to visas for, Australian by the Australian government. So,
Right.
has that that controversy been put to rest? Is there is something like that still happening, or is that
Honey,
no longer the?
You'll be surprised to hear there was never a ban on students from any state. What happened is that a couple of years ago, and this was not this year, that was possibly last year beginning, or maybe even earlier, maybe last year beginning, there was an increase in the number of fraudulent documents being presented for admission and visas from certain parts of India. Now, it was not necessarily all students from those states, but certain parts had a greater number of fraudulent financial and academic documents being part of the application process. So, of course, universities saw greater number of visa refusals coming out from certain regions. So they increased their own checks, and that led to them for a period of time applying a pause on new applications from certain states. Now, this was only a handful of universities who did that. Even while there was a pause, if there was a brilliant application, they would still accept it. Now comes the second part. The government of Australia never put a ban anyway.
Okay.
There were more
Okay.
visa refusals from certain regions as compared to other for a particular region, but even there, the good quality students still made it. Now I can tell you for sure, almost all universities are accepting applications from every part of India. Visa processes have changed a bit. The funds requirement are more readily shown. And also the government of India's initiative towards things like DigiLocker, where academic documents can be possibly verified and they come through a particular, the DigiLocker mechanism through the checks. That helps ensure quality. There are more number of English language tests being accepted by Australia. That has increased the number of options to students so they can easily take any of these tests and be able to demonstrate through the score that they can speak English. And the third thing is about the financials. I think a lot of it is now digital. Universities are doing a fair bit of checking on their end. And so when you put everything together, these problems lead to solutions. And now we are seeing a little better time with regards to visa grant rate. If you look up online and look at the Australian stats for immigration, you'll find the highest visa grant rate for this year as compared to last many years. And this by itself is a reflection on the quality of visa applications coming before the visa officers.
Right. That's good to know. So, before we let you go, I have to ask you one last question since you are an industry expert and, a very well respected name in the industry. If just be asking you, Ravi, to take if you could give a very ballpark figure of what it costs to study in an Australian university,
Okay.
given the current
Australian
exchange, etc.
Perfect, perfect. Australian universities for an undergraduate course costs somewhere around between 30,000 Australian dollars to about 45,000 Australian dollars in tuition fees. And Australian dollar is about 55 rupees. So when you really multiply that, it comes to somewhere around 15 to 20 lakh rupees or something, some figure like that for tuition fees per year. There are scholarships being given by Australian universities which help reduce the tuition fees. The living costs come on top of it. International students, especially Indian students, do work part-time. They're allowed to work 24 hours per week part-time. And per week wage minimum is about $25. So when you really do all those costs together, the cost of studying actually is not that much more, and in fact is quite a good deal.
Right. Right. Thank you so much, Ravi. A pleasure talking to you as always.
Wonderful, Ishani. Thank you very much to you guys.